Hi, everyone, and welcome to Tell Me About Podcast, where each week two nerdy friends deep dive random topics. I'm Laura,
And I'm Tom.
and this is episode number 19.
Yes, thank you. And Laura, today we're going to go back. And by going back, we're going to look into the future.
The future?
That's right, Laura, the future. In fact, we're going to go all the way to the year 2000. In the year 2000! In the year 2000! Please don't sue me, Conan.
That actually wasn't bad.
I think Bamba would be proud. But today we are looking back at the year 2000 and specifically the start of the year 2000. Yes, today we are going 24 years back into the future and looking at Y2K, a very silly problem that led to a very real and very, very American crisis.
I remember it was a very wild time.
Wild might be putting it mildly. It was chaos. And you have to remember, this is pre 9/11 and everything that came after 9/11. This is something that morphed from very fringe to very mainstream very quickly and just took on a life of its own that I don't think anyone could have imagined. And so we're going to talk about it today.
I'm really interested to hear the origin of this. I do remember, obviously, I was 14 at the time. So I definitely remember the panic of it and the craziness of it, but I don't know too much about where it started, how it originated, how it ramped up so quickly. So I'm really interested to hear about this.
So really the story of Y2K starts, of course, in 1977. It starts with a man named Peter DeYager. And Peter DeYager is a software engineer who first notices in 1977 an issue with the computers at IBM. Now, what he notices is something that seems very small, but is going to become very big. He notices that the calendar, the years, the programming and the computer to show what year it is only goes up to 1999. Now, why is that important? So, when computers start entering the business world in the 60s and 70s, we're not talking about laptops, we're not talking about desktops, we're not even talking about the big monitor systems of even the 80s and the laptops that were like a stone tablet from the early 90s and the 80s. We're talking about rooms, sheds, houses that are just one computer, just massive machines of software and coding, and it almost looks like a control room for a power plant. Now, at this time, memory is very expensive, as everything with a computer is. It's very expensive. And so software engineers are kind of tasked with maximizing memory for the least price. And so what they do is they write, and I apologize, I am not a software engineer, so this is just my understanding of it. When they write the code for the program, instead of writing the code for 4 years, 4 digits, they only write it for 2. And this is to save space, memory.
It's all about the bottom line.
You said it, not me. But the point of it is that the last 2 years would keep changing, which, again, in 1965, 1970, makes sense.
My question already is that even in the 70s, they didn't think ahead 30 years that this was eventually going to be a problem?
Well, and that's the thing. And that's where Peter DeYager comes in. He's the first person that really notices, hey, by having the programs designed this way, where only the last 2 numbers of the year change and where the 19 is fixed, you're going to create a problem because when the year 2000 comes, the computer's not going to be able to change it. It's going to revert back to 1900. basically, well, that's 23 years away. We're not worried about 23 years away. That's 23 years away. That's not my problem. That's 23 years away me's problem.
It's kind of like at work when you get something on a Friday and you're like, yeah, that's Monday's problem.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's not my Friday problem. That's That's Monday's me problem. So, as Peter DeYager tells it, he doesn't worry about it. It's only in the mid 80s, early 90s when he realizes it's no longer 23 years away. It's now 10, 12 years away. One news report calls him the Paul Revere of computing, saying the dates are coming, the dates are coming.
That's clever.
That is very clever, and you're going to see the news media, specifically kind of the 24-hour news cycle that really has taken effect in the late 90s, really plays a huge role in where this kind of goes off the rails. But in 1993, DeYager writes a 3-page newsletter called Doomsday 2000, basically talking about how these wrong date calculations are going to have critical, catastrophic effects on basically life in general.
From what I remember, it was every industry was going to be affected by this.
Every industry was going to be affected by this because by this point, even in the early 90s, everything's connected by computers. So they're talking about the banking industry, they're talking about the power grid, they're talking about one thing that becomes clear and that he doesn't really emphasize before, but it becomes emphasized later on, is that it's not really the household electronics that are really the issue. It's the banking systems, it's the electrical system, it's all the defense systems that are now computerized. Missiles. That was the big worry, was that basically nuclear power plants were going to go down, nukes were going to start flying in the air like fireworks into the sky, and missiles would just be floating around willy-nilly.
I remember there being a worry that planes would just drop out of the sky.
Well, and the planes dropping out of the sky that was like the very famous kind of extreme example. And that was the one that really gets portrayed in popular culture. The Simpsons, Family Guy, they both do episodes about Y2K and about the collapse of the world. The Simpsons line when I think it was a Treehouse of Horror episode about Y2K, and Marge, as the planes are just dropping out of the sky, she goes, "Who's going to clean all that up?" The Family Guy one, I think, was about all the nukes go off and the family is left wandering the streets to rebuild civilization around the only thing that could survive a nuclear blast, which is Twinkies. But the planes dropping out of the sky is the first one. In 1993, no one really pays attention to it. It's kind of just on the fringe. It's on the fringes of what's the very early, almost prehistoric stages of the internet.
It's still a Monday problem at that point.
Also, too, there are a lot of other things that are going on in the country in the mid 90s. Most notably, there was a criminal trial you may have heard about. There was also, shall we say, certain scandals involving a certain president, and we'll just leave it at that. But by 1996, DeYager has now gained an audience with Congress, and he starts talking about how this needs to get fixed ASAP. And really, it's by the late 90s, 1996, 1997, that now other people start to see the same problem. People are now starting to realize, oh shit, there's something wrong here. It's one thing to replace all the bolts on a bridge. It's another to have to replace all the bolts on every bridge in the world, and you only have 25 months to do it. And that's kind of what it was. So all of these computers had to be retrofitted to fix the date problem. That's what is kind of the amazing thing about all of this, is that it's dates. It's literally 2 fixed digits in a program, in a computer, that caused all of this chaos.
It seems so minute when you say it like that.
It seems so minute. In fact, it's even referenced, if you go back and watch Office Space, they even reference the Y2K problem in Office Space. That's how they say they won't be able to find the virus. It's just like Superman 3.
And that was Peter's job, was essentially updating the code for the 2000 Switch.
Yeah. And now that, again, that's in 1999. So by that point, it's entered the general consciousness, and it's also entered the pop culture consciousness at that point.
It's funny to me that nobody cared until there was such little time left that there was nothing to do but panic. And I think you'll get into it, but it just got blown up way more than it should have been.
Well, as human beings, we are nothing if not procrastinators. As 2000 gets closer, more people start listening to Dieger. More people start heeding his warnings. Dieger basically creates a cottage industry for himself out of basically telling anyone who will listen about this, speaking with companies, speaking with governments. Again, he creates a whole cottage industry for himself just out of being the Y2K guy.
Did he leave IBM at this point and was on his own?
He was on his own by this point.
Okay.
And he was running his own website. He was selling his own books about how to make computers Y2K compliant.
But he truly thought this was an issue.
The wild part about this is it was an issue. And I'm going to get to that in a second. Like, this was not, the fears were very real, which makes what happens in the 2 years leading up to Y2K so chaotic. By this point, in 1997, 1998, people are now starting to talk about it. TV news are starting to do stories about it. You have people like Peter Jennings and Dan Rather and Tom Brokaw, sitting at a desk and with the gravitas in their voice talking about the year 2000 and the big computer crisis.
As they were smoking those heaters.
Well, they didn't let them smoke the heaters at that point. They were smoking the heaters. They were ducking under the desks to smoke the heaters during breaks. By the way, there's a great SNL skit. I forget who it was. Might have either been Phil Hartman or Dana Carvey. I think it was Dana Carvey, and he's as Tom Brokaw. And Tom Brokaw basically wants to take the summer off, so they have him read just a bunch of hypothetical news stories, and one of them is like, President Clinton mauled by wolves. It's at this point that the media is started to pick up on it. And you know how media tends to work. When they see a story's getting traction, well, that's the only thing you see. And because that drives ratings. I say this not as a conspiracy, the media is lying to you, this and that. I say this as someone who wanted to be in media. I was as a journalism major. What drives electronic media, specifically cable news, television news, is ratings. They're going to air the stories that they know are going to get ratings. I mean, there's a reason why, morbid as it sounds, one of the tenets of TV news is if it bleeds, it leads.
And I think back then, too, compared to today, there was a lot more longevity in these stories, like with the O.J. Simpson trial and Y2K and 9/11. You got months and months and months, if not years, out of coverage out of these stories, unlike today.
And that's what ends up happening. You get months and months of coverage, and as that happens, people go off the rails. People go batshit. And what occurs as a result over 1998 and 1999 is very much America writ large. You have people scared out of their minds that the world is going to end. You have people who now see this as a profit opportunity and start selling Y2K compliant food and Y2K compliant solar panels.
Question for you. Do you think, and I'm sure that there was times in prior history where this was a thing, maybe not to this scale, But do you really think this was maybe the first big doomsday prep event, or at least in modern history, that we've seen in this country?
The first in my lifetime.
Hmm.
And it had parallels to something else, and I'll get to that later. You start seeing things like Y2K preparedness events, people buying tickets to listen to survivalists talk about how to live off the grid, people moving to the country, to more rural areas. One of the things that stuck in my mind, I just watched the HBO documentary that came out a couple of weeks ago about the Y2K crisis, and it was all just kind of spliced together news clips and raw video feeds. Really, there were three examples that really kind of illuminate what the mindset of the country was at this point. Two of them were in the first 20 seconds of the documentary, where they cut to these people that are learning how to make pelts and live off the land. And the person they interview is this lady who was a software compliance engineer at her company. And she just goes, "It's just too much," with tears in her eyes. I can't do it all. It's just too much. So I've given up, and I'm going to live off the land, as they show her making a bow out of a tree branch. And the third one was a lady who said that she had sold her business and all her worldly possessions to move out to a rural area and have a farm, because she was afraid that basically all of her appliances were going to fail and burn the house down during Y2K. So this is the mindset of the country in 1998 and really in 1999. 1999 is where it just hits turbo drive. 1999 is where the truly American phenomenon of the media circus, it just goes into full tilt. Now everyone sees their moment. You have televangelists talking about how this is the rapture. You have survivalists talking about, the government's lying to you. The militias talking about this is their moment to rise up. People are buying tickets to go stand in convention halls and listen to survivalists talk about living off the land while they're selling Y2K compliant food.
As you were talking about how the media in 1999, they just went off the rails with it, was it all year, or was it kind of ramped up the last couple months?
I think it was really the last couple of months where it really kind of, ramps up. Because in the last couple of months, 1999, there's really not a heck of a lot going on. Even during this whole time, it's still kind of there, and it's still kind of its own media atmosphere. I mean, you have a point where in the middle of all the chaos in his second term, Bill Clinton basically has a presidential committee on Y2K.
Did it have some official, long, stupid acronym name?
No, but it had a Y2K czar.
Of course it did.
His name was John Koskinen, and he was the Y2K czar. He was there to oversee, companies and governments making preparations and making sure everything is going smoothly. Meanwhile, while all this is happening, people are stockpiling water, they're building bunkers. There was one guy who was interviewed who's basically says, "Well, if the grid goes down, we're going to see violence like the LA riots, and people are going to be desperate, and that's when you could see killings, and people are going to be desperate and want aid, and we don't want to decide who gets it and who doesn't, so we're just not going to give it to anyone, and we're going to we're going to get our own secret compound that no one knows about."
That sounds like some bullshit.
This is where the country is. All these breathless stories about Y2K and Y2, and are we ready, and Y2K. What they don't know is behind the scenes, Koskinen's job is to basically make sure everyone is ready and try to get as many computers up and compliant as they can.
Did they talk about how he did that?
They don't go into it in the documentary, but there's a Time magazine article that talks about basically that corporations, local, federal, foreign governments, basically all, they crowdsource this thing all together. I think there was a stat in the Time magazine article that said companies spent over $100 billion getting their software Y2K compliant.
That's so funny because they wanted to save pennies, I'm assuming, on saving the memory back in the 70s, and now it's costing them billions of dollars.
What ends up happening is you have almost unheard of global buy-in. You have governments around the world helping each other to get this ready. This is like the global unifying event. The last stand of humanity and Independence Day when Bill Pullman's giving the speech on the megaphone.
Honestly, that's probably the last time that even happened.
It's something that's never happened, that probably never happened before or since.
But hats off to the diplomacy.
I mean, yeah, it's the bare minimum. You know, you even will go so far that by New Year's Eve of 1999, you have American and Russian government engineers in a room together, basically crossing their fingers that everything is okay. So it's in all of this mayhem that Yeager now goes from the Warner of Doom to almost the calming force. It's a complete 180. The guy who had a couple years prior was telling anyone who would listen that this needed to be taken care of right now is now telling everyone that would listen it's being handled, it's going well, and things are under control. Because of the work that's being done, it's not going to be as big of a problem. Now, the reason why he's doing this is because by this point, his message has been hijacked. The opportunists who saw this as an opportunity to profit for themselves, and profit in terms of money, profit in terms of exposure, profit in terms of grown membership for their cause, they have now basically hijacked this entire thing. You know, it's a means to their end of what they're trying to accomplish. In a lot of ways, it's a misinformation campaign. And now Yeager is kind of put in the position of having to kind of debunk a lot of these rumors. Yeah, really the biggest one is at this point that this is like the rapture. The televangelists are having a field day with all of this. They're selling videos about this is the rapture. They're selling DVDs. They're selling books. They're basically anything they could put on with you're going to die at the year 2000 because you sinned. So it's at this point that Yeager has to take that stance.
I imagine that he never anticipated this when he first started, that he would have to do this complete 180 because it would have gotten so out of control.
And I think he was annoyed by it too.
I would be too, especially as I imagine he started in a place of good intention, and then to see this, runaway train.
It's under all of this chaos that we finally get to New Year's 1999. Here's a fun little crossover with our mini episode. Peter Jennings comes on TV at 5 o'clock in the morning, Eastern Time, to host almost 24 straight hours of coverage on ABC to show New Year's all over the world. And as New Year's comes in, first in places like New Zealand, Guam, and then Australia, you keep hearing every hour, okay, things are holding up. We're holding. We're steady. We're so far so good. Knock on wood. Like they actually had a Y2K reporter reporting from a bunker saying basically every hour, we're good.
It still always confuses me on how this was supposed to happen. Was it just supposed to be kind of a collective thing, like all at once
And
the first, you know what I mean? Or was it supposed to happen every hour across the world?
Well, and I think the pervasive feeling is that it was basically going to sweep the world every hour as a New Year came in. I think that was what the belief was, because you even hear Peter Jennings when they're about to show New Zealand. He goes, "We're going to start with New Zealand." He goes, "This is the first real test, like it's a battleground state on election night." The only thing missing from all this was like Steve Kornacki on the board drawing up. Now this is the one we were looking at, folks. If this goes dark,
A young Steve Kornacki was probably mapping that from home.
sleeves rolled up to his biceps. If he's of legal age, maybe housing an adult beverage. If New Zealand goes dark, then we expect Australia to go dark. I don't see a path for the world surviving past 10 o'clock. The world has never survived when Australia goes dark. So as each hour comes in, nothing happens. It's just like every New Year's Eve. Now, a fascinating subplot to all of this is while this is all going on, December 31st, 1999 is also a very notable day because it's the day that Boris Yeltsin resigns as the president of Russia and hands it over to his prime minister, Vladimir Putin. Leave that for what it is. As the hours pass, nothing's happening. We get through Asia, nothing happens. Now we're entering Europe, and England's okay, and Paris is okay. So far, so good.
I still remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the US being, I'm sorry, we're a bit arrogant sometimes. I feel like they thought, well, when it hits the US, then it's going to be a major thing. I guess more so in terms of the power grid, but yeah, right?
The concern was the power grid, the concern was the airplanes, the concern was the nukes. Or the missiles, I should say. Because who has more missiles than we do?
Nobody, motherfucker.
That's right. And also, too, you have to remember, too, I know for both you and for me, we're consuming American media. American media, especially in the 90s, was very much a stance of, well, if it's not happening here, what's the point?
Oh, 100%, yeah. Speaking to the arrogance that I mentioned.
There was also a fear, people were fearful, and this is why they were stocking up. There was a report that they were afraid that bin Laden was going to attack America at 12 o'clock on January 1st.
I don't remember that.
I don't either. So finally, the moment of truth arrives, and we get to, of course, the only New Year's Eve that matters, midnight New York, because fuck time zones, am I right?
As we talked about in our New Year's Eve episode, Eastern time zone has such another arrogance about it. And honestly, we in our minds think that, this time zone is the only one that matters.
For America, this is the crescendo. This is the moment of truth. Moments tick away, and everyone's kind of sweaty and nervous, except for the people in Times Square who are already at this point drunk off their ass.
I was going to say, do you think the people in Times Square were a little bit more anxious that year? But you're right, they were probably pretty intoxicated.
Oh, they did interviews, and those kids were gone by like 9 o'clock.
It was this huge celebration paralleled with this panic and fear. It was such a dichotomy, I remember. It was just a very weird day.
It was a weird week. Yeah, I remember you're off from school that week. When you're growing up and you're home from school at like 12 o'clock on a Tuesday, and it's not the summertime, it's like a weird feeling because you feel like you're in like a different dimension. You're in a world that you have no idea exists. Like you ever have that day where you're just like you had to go somewhere or do something, and you were out in the world like with your parents, and it's like it was like a November Tuesday at like 10 o'clock, and you're out in the world, and you're like, I shouldn't be here. This is the forbidden land.
I still feel that way to some degree. I work a typical 9 to 5 Monday through Friday. So when I have off during the week, it just feels like a little extra weird, but a little extra special that it's like, all right, I'm not at work. So it is a bit different, but yeah, I get what you mean.
But I remember we didn't do any preparations. We didn't believe in any of that. So as the final minutes approach, Dick Clark is talking to a nation on the edge. The dulcet tones saying, well, people didn't come out, but we're glad you're here because it's bumping up our viewership numbers. You're going to watch this beautiful ball drop. Of course, this being the millennium, this was the special ball. This was the pretty ball, the new ball. I do remember it being a little nervous that last minute. And, then you hit the last 10 seconds and it's like, okay, what's going to happen? And then 12 o'clock comes and not a thing.
It was like a countdown to a bomb going off, and then the bomb doesn't go off.
Exactly. And then life just continues on.
I also remember there was this like pause, I think, in the first couple seconds after midnight, just to make sure everything was okay. And then it was just so anticlimactic. I mean, I'm glad it was anticlimactic, but that was the feeling.
You're kind of like you're patting yourself. Okay, lights are working, everything's good. It was it, and then it was over. And then it's like, okay, well, now what do we do? I think it was really in that moment. And by the way, if you watch the HBO documentary or if you've seen it already, it's all kind of leading up to this. This is the climax of the movie. This is the payoff. Or how the documentary really kind of portrays this is what was a very nerve-wracking event almost becomes a show of unity. What ends up happening is you see all these people coming together to celebrate. And whether they celebrate nothing happening or whether they're celebrating just the new year, it ends up being a unifying event. It's in those couple minutes after that people realize, yeah, nothing happened, but also, we just saw a new millennium.
Yeah, there was a huge sense of relief that almost kind of gave way to the celebration. But I also think it's a shame that the changing of the century was very much overshadowed by this.
It was. And even after, for the couple of days after, there was still a Y2K beat at CNN, reporting on, well, it's 3 days afterwards, holding steady, holding steady. It was finally after, like, I think it was either January 4th or January 5th that President Clinton disbands the special committee on Y2K. The czar, fades out of public consciousness.
I was going to say, I hope the czar got another job.
I mean, that job probably set him up for life. It set the Jaeger up for life. It's then after that it all kind of fades away. And one thing that I thought was extremely poignant, I guess very ominous, is one of the last clips of the documentary is a news report clip of Brian Williams from NBC. And he's talking, well, now that Y2K is over, we can focus on the rest of the news. And oh, by the way, and you may have forgotten because of Y2K, 2000 is a presidential year. And hence, that Pandora's box got opened. And that's a whole nother episode, folks. And so we left the Y2K news cycle and we entered into the Bush versus Gore election news cycle.
We rolled right into that one, didn't we?
Just gluttons for punishment. But the story of Y2K is really one that it was everything and it was nothing. It was not necessarily a media creation because it was an issue. It was an actual issue that would have caused major problems had it not been dealt with.
But it was a media amplification.
It was definitely a media amplification, but it was a real issue. And in fact, Paul Sappho, who's an adjunct professor at Stanford, quoted in Time as saying, the Y2K crisis didn't happen precisely because people started preparing for it over a decade in advance. And the general public, who was busy stocking up on supplies and stuff, didn't have a sense that the programmers were on the job. And it was really kind of a great example of when people collaborate and actually work together. Something may have happened if we all then worked together as much as we did.
That also wasn't the lead of the story,
And that's where the media amplification comes in. Because, let's face it, could have devastating effects, but people are working on it isn't a sexy story.
No.
But could have devastating effects is. I mean, you have to remember too, like, it wasn't just the plain news. This was debated on all the talk shows. This is debated on all the political debate shows. You have Dieger going on Crossfire when he's getting yelled at by, at least one panelist saying that he wanted to be the prospect of doom because it was good business for him.
And I think this is another example in history, or at least specifically US history, where fear-mongering by media was just so rampant. And it led to control of the masses, essentially, and kind of guiding the emotion of the masses.
It's definitely an example of why cable news was a mistake. For cable news, this was a boon. This was a year and a half, 2 years of basically guaranteed content on top of everything else that was going on.
It was essentially positive reinforcement for them that this type of shit works.
Well, exactly. It's positive reinforcement of kind of the echo chamber of the 24-hour news cycle and cable news. You talk about it, you have analysts on to talk about it, then you have other analysts to debate the analysts about talking about it. Of course, you have to remember, too, cable news does not exist in a vacuum. These are not mom and pop outlets. These are cable channels run by massive corporations. You had Time Warner running CNN, you had Fox, you had MSNBC. These all had big corporations and big networks behind them.
I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall during these rating analytic discussions around this time.
Because you have to remember too, at this time, the late 90s, Turner has an empire. Time Warner Turner has a media empire at this point. And CNN was a massive ratings draw for them. Not in large part because it was breathless coverage of, things like Y2K. So it's really, in a lot of ways, kind of a lesson. I don't want to say a lesson in media literacy, but a lesson in kind of how quickly, especially in America, how quickly things can snowball once it kind of gets into the media stream, once it gets into the media consciousness, and once it just kind of starts feeding the beast, so to speak.
So I have another question in terms of the actual Y2K logistics. So is everything switched over in time, or did what they think was going to happen just not happen? Was it a combination? You know what I mean?
It was mostly, based on my research, most things were switched over in time. The ones that weren't reportedly had very minimal, if no, ill effects. So it may have been kind of a combination of both, but it was definitely, at the very least, it was switched over in time. And that's really a great credit to a lot of people who worked very, very hard to get this done.
Did the media report on that? Was there any explanation of why everything they said might happen didn't happen?
The Y2K czar had a whole bunch of media of interviews where he credited the work that his engineers and everyone did to get things as ready as possible. He was from the official Y2K bunker, which again just kind of speaks to the absurdity of kind of where this ended up. But I couldn't help thinking about that when I was doing research about this. We're only 12 years removed from the supposed rapture, right? The one that was supposed to happen at sunset in December 2012 at 6 o'clock, and we were all supposed to, the ones who were the good, the quote unquote good people were supposed to rise up, and I guess the rest of us would be stuck in, I don't know if you've ever seen This Is the End with Seth Rogen. I guess we'd all be, we'd all be stuck there with the monsters and, Craig Robinson kicking Aziz Ansari into the hole.
Yeah, that was definitely on the apocalyptic scale. That was like a baby Y2K. Yeah.
And I kept thinking about that because that did get a lot of media attention like the last week or so too.
But you have to agree that I think Y2K was taken much more seriously than 2012 was.
Well, because Y2K was an actual thing.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
I
Well,
mean,
to some people, the 2012 thing was an actual thing that was
well, and
coming.
that was the other thing too. Is when one of the other things that the documentary through kind of the that they put together. One of them being a whole narration on Y2K by Leonard Nimoy, looking very much like Steve Jobs, and like the tall black turtleneck and the black sports blazer, corporate Spock. I wasn't expecting that. But one of the things is Y2K basically became almost like a choose your own adventure because no matter what you thought of it, you were right. Or you can kind of manipulate what actually happened into a way of saying you were right. For the
Everybody wins.
exactly, everyone gets kind of what they and that's really was kind of the moral of it is everyone kind of gets what they want out of it. For the people that thought this was just an overblown media hype event, they were right. They got to be say that they were right. For the people that said the crisis was averted because of the hard work of governments and cooperation from across the world, they were right. That one was probably based more in fact. I can't tell you if the militias or the televangelists were proven right, but they're going to claim they are. But really, it's a unique thing because basically everyone wins, everyone gets to say they were right, and everyone kind of gets what they want out of it. And plus, nothing happened
Yeah, I was going to say without any fallout from it.
without any fault. I mean, it's kind of the perfect media story because everyone kind of gets what they want out of it.
And as you were saying that, I was thinking that yeah, I don't remember a lot of like finger pointing after the fact of like, well, you said this was going to happen and it didn't. It was just more of relief, and then we kind of moved on, you know?
And that was it. We kind of moved on. Everyone got to take their conclusions out of it. As quickly as it seemed to pop up in the public consciousness, that's how quickly it disappeared. Within less than a year, it was almost like, oh yeah.
And then I feel like you didn't hear about it again until like like maybe 2010, and they were doing like decade in review. Like, remember, hey, Y2K was a thing.
I could only imagine what the tweets and what the Facebook statuses would have been like if we had social media in 2000.
The snark alone would have been so good.
Basically, someone would have been made the main character on Twitter, which is never good. That's never what you want. It was a wild time that went as quickly as it came. And I don't really know if we've had anything like that really before or quite frankly since.
I don't think anything quite of this nature, but I don't think there was anything like this that had the opportunity to arise, you know? And I've said before on this podcast, I think us as a generation, the millennials, we lived through a hell of a time so far. Like a lot of weird fucking shit. And Y2K was definitely one of them. And we were talking a little bit before we started recording about what we remember. And as I mentioned earlier, like I do remember a lot of the fear and a lot of the craziness and the planes falling out of the sky and just the constant news coverage and, everything that you mentioned. To me, I think that the emotional toll that was taken on people, like the fear and the anxiety and the money that was spent unnecessarily, like it's just, I mean, it's very American, let's say that, but it was for what, you know?
And that's why, I really do recommend if you have a chance to watch the HBO documentary, watch it because it's really interesting. And it really kind of gives a good idea and good window into what the American psyche was like basically by the time we got to December 31st, 1999. The one thing I would love to say is for all of our international listeners, because I know we're big in Canada, we're growing in Canada, but really what I would love to know from people who are listening to us from outside the United States if you remember Y2K, if you were old enough to remember that, we want to kind of know what your memories are of it, because obviously, like we mentioned, Americans tend to worry only about America because that's the bubble that we tend to live in. That's the worldview that very much is made a part of you. Tell us, let us know, what was Y2K like for you? Was anyone really worried? Was it a media kind of frenzy in your country and where you were compared to where it was in America? Definitely hit us up on our social media, hit us up on Gmail, and let us know, because we want to hear from you, because it's definitely one of those events. If you're old enough to remember it, it's kind of a where were you type of deal.
Okay, everyone, that's our show. So tune in next week for another episode. I'm going to cover something that was a big part of U.S. history that I don't think people know a ton about. So I'm really excited to dig into that story. So tune in next week for that. And please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the Tell Me About Podcast. It really does help our show reach more people. So please go follow us on our socials and send us comments and episode suggestions to the Tell Me About Podcast at gmail.com. See you next week, everybody.
Bye.